In the shadow-drenched wilderness of the Adirondacks, where ancient mountains whisper forgotten secrets, a tale of obsession, betrayal, and unimaginable cruelty unfurls with devastating force. Two radiant lives, Daniel and Marissa, vanished into the abyss of 2014, swallowed by the forest's deceptive silence. Years later, their skeletal remains emerge shackled within a cavern of terror, igniting a relentless storm of grief, vengeance, and revelation. At the heart of this sinister labyrinth stands a retired ranger, scarred by failure, an FBI haunted by shadows, and a sister who discovers the unspeakable truth that the monster was once someone she loved. The summer of 2014 settled gently over the Adirondacks, the kind of season that lured tourists with its green canopies, glacial lakes, and whispers of trails that wound endlessly through the wilderness. Among those drawn to its beauty were Daniel Reyes and Marissa Clark, a young couple from Los Angeles who had traded palm trees for pines, hoping their first trip to upstate New York would be the kind of adventure they could capture on film and treasure forever. They carried with them not just backpacks and tents, but the restless optimism of their mid-20s, recording snippets of laughter on Daniel's handheld camera as they stumbled across streams, pointing out deer and teasing each other about who could keep pace on the steeper climbs. Yet beneath the postcard scenery, the mountains carried their own reputation. Rumors of vanished hikers, strange disappearances etched into local folklore, stories most tourists dismissed as ghost tales told around a campfire. By late afternoon on their third day, the couple strayed from the mapped trail, chasing what Daniel described as the perfect overlook. The camera captured his last words, Marissa's silhouette against a sunlit ridge, and then the footage ended abruptly with a jarring fall of static and silence, as though the forest itself had swallowed them whole. When they failed to check out of their lodge that evening, the alarm was raised. Park rangers launched a search that stretched into days, combing ravines, caves, and lake shores. Helicopters scoured the canopy while volunteers lit lanterns along forgotten paths. But the Adirondacks are vast, and the mountains hold their secrets tightly. Rain washed away footprints, winds scattered scents the dogs might have tracked. Each day without a trace frayed the hope of their families back in Los Angeles, and the case slowly shifted from rescue to recovery. Among the rangers was Eli Turner, a man already carrying the weight of too many unsolved cases. Eli had spent decades patrolling the wilderness, guiding lost hikers back to safety and writing reports for families who never received closure. He had seen the mountains take lives before, but something about Daniel and Marissa's disappearance haunted him. They were young, unprepared for more than a scenic hike, yet they had not simply wandered into danger. They had vanished without a sound, as if led somewhere deliberately. Still, after weeks of searching, funding dwindled, and the official rescue ended. Flyers faded on notice boards, the story sank beneath larger headlines, and the Adirondacks returned to their quiet indifference. For Rachel Clark, Marissa's older sister, the silence was unbearable. She flew east to post missing person flyers herself, knocking on doors of locals, pressing rangers for details, begging Eli for answers he did not have. She carried the gnawing suspicion that someone knew more than they admitted, that her sister's laughter hadn't simply been lost to the wind. But by winter, the trails closed under snow, and Daniel and Marissa became another entry in the long ledger of Adirondack mysteries. Unsolved, unexplained, unfinished, until the mountains would speak again. 3 years later, the Adirondacks had all but erased the memory of Daniel and Marissa, except for the occasional whispered story told in diners when tourists asked about the vanished couple.
For Rachel, the grief had hardened into something quieter, a wound that never fully closed but dulled with time. For Eli Turner, now fully retired, the disappearance still lingered like a burr under his skin. Age had slowed his legs, but the forest remained his home. And on a damp September morning in 2017, he returned to a seldom-used trail he had patrolled years before. The woods were heavy with mist, the kind that curled low and made even familiar terrain feel foreign. Following the sound of dripping water, Eli noticed a gap behind a tangle of stone and brush, half concealed by years of moss and debris. His butt tightened. He had walked this way dozens of times, yet never noticed the hollow that opened like a throat in the earth. Curiosity wrestled with dread as he edged closer, pushing aside vines and slipping into the dark mouth of a cave. At first, the air was only cool and damp, but as his flashlight beam pierced deeper, it froze over what lay within. Two forms shackled to the rock, skeletal remains slumped in grotesque stillness, their chains still biting into bone. The cave was not merely a grave, it was a chamber of cruelty. Around the remains lay scattered objects, scorched scraps of clothing, crude symbols smeared in faded paint along the stone, a rusted tin can with teeth marks, and a small journal, its pages warped by moisture, yet still legible. Eli's breath caught as he recognized Marissa's necklace glinting in the beam of light. His heart sank. The couple from Los Angeles had not simply vanished, they had been imprisoned, tormented, and abandoned in this hidden crypt. Within hours, the site swarmed with FBI agents and state police, their floodlights transforming the cave into a grim stage. The media descended, cameras flashing as they broadcast the Adirondack cave murders across the nation. The public latched on, fascinated and horrified, comparing the case to cult killings and ritualistic crimes. Rachel arrived soon after, her face pale with a mix of shock and vindication. Her instincts had been right all along. Yet the horror deepened when forensic teams began piecing together the timeline. Daniel's bones bore signs of early decay consistent with death in 2014, but Marissa's showed evidence of survival long beyond. The fractures of shackles around her wrists were newer. Her hair, found in clumps, suggested captivity that stretched into 2015, maybe 2016. This revelation cracked Rachel's world open. Her sister had been alive long after the search had ended, enduring unspeakable torment while the world moved on. Eli, too, was shaken, haunted by the realization that in his retirement, just miles away, a life was still being lived in chains. The FBI's lead agent, Special Agent Carter, announced a full investigation, hinting at organized activity rather than a lone predator. The cave, with its grotesque artifacts, suggested ritual, planning, and intent. The whispers of local folklore transformed into panic, and the Adirondacks, once a tourist escape, became a place synonymous with horror.
The cave discovery ignited an investigation unlike anything the Adirondacks had seen in decades. Special Agent Carter brought in a full FBI task force, while Eli Turner, though officially retired, was asked to consult because of his unmatched knowledge of the region. The cave became a crime scene sealed off by yellow tape, and its grim contents were cataloged piece by piece. The journal, when dried and carefully opened, revealed pages filled with erratic handwriting. Some entries appeared to be Marissa's desperate scribbles, while others carried an unfamiliar, obsessive hand. Phrases like, "She belongs here," and "Rachel will understand in time," sent a shiver through investigators. The press clung to the theory of a local drifter or hidden cult, and for a while the FBI followed that path. One man, a transient with a history of violence who had camped nearby in 2015, was dragged in as a suspect. His arrest made headlines, but cracks appeared quickly. DNA didn't match, alibis checked out, and the case against him crumbled. What lingered, however, was the unmistakable sense that this was not random wilderness horror. It was targeted, deliberate, and personal. Rachel, desperate for answers, pored over the evidence herself, sitting in on briefings whenever Carter allowed. She noticed something others had overlooked. The handwriting in the journal bore eerie similarities to letters she once received from her ex-boyfriend, Michael, back in Los Angeles. She brushed it off at first, convinced her grief was making her see patterns where none existed. But when forensic analysts compared the scrawled notes to samples pulled from Rachel's old correspondence, the match was undeniable. Michael, charming and manipulative in their youth, had left her years ago with a trail of obsessive behavior, angry voicemails, erratic visits, even a restraining order she'd filed but never pursued. The thought that he had traveled across the country, hunted down her sister, and orchestrated this grotesque captivity was almost too monstrous to accept. Carter, initially skeptical, reopened files on Michael and uncovered damning evidence. Receipts for camping equipment and heavy chains purchased in upstate New York. GPS data placing him near the Adirondacks at the exact time of the couple's disappearance. Even a witness account from a gas station attendant who remembered a nervous man with California plates. The puzzle snapped into a horrific picture. Michael hadn't just killed Marissa and Daniel, he had intended Marissa as a stand-in for Rachel, a twisted punishment for the relationship that had ended years earlier. Eli, sitting in the briefing room, felt his stomach turn as the motive became clear. The cave was not chosen at random, but as a stage for Michael's deranged fixation. When Michael was finally arrested in Los Angeles, the facade of his normal life shattered under the glare of media lights. Calm and smirking, he offered chilling half-confessions that unsettled even hardened agents. He taunted investigators, hinting at accomplices, at others who believed Rachel needed to learn. For Rachel, the betrayal cut deeper than grief. The man she once loved had not only destroyed her sister's life, but had stolen years of her own peace. As the investigation closed in, the case shifted from wilderness mystery to a national headline about obsession, cruelty, and the darkness people carry within.
The trial of Michael Hayes, the man now accused of orchestrating the disappearance and death of Daniel Reyes and Marissa Clark, became a national spectacle, the kind of courtroom saga that drew reporters from across the country and filled every available seat with family members, journalists, and curious locals who had followed the case since the cave discovery. The courthouse itself seemed to groan under the weight of expectation, the old wooden benches and echoing hallways steeped in tension each morning as Michael was led in under heavy guard. Dressed in a plain gray suit, his hair neatly combed, he looked more like a tired accountant than the monster painted by prosecutors, and that eerie normalcy unsettled the public most of all. Rachel Clark sat in the gallery, her eyes locked on the man who had once kissed her under the Los Angeles sun, who had whispered promises of love, now accused of shackling her sister to a cave wall to rot in the dark. The prosecution opened with brutal clarity, photographs of the cave projected onto a large screen, the skeletal remains in shackles, the journal entries scrawled in handwriting that forensic experts testified matched Michael's. They laid out the receipts for chains and camping gear, the GPS data that placed him in the Adirondacks during the week Daniel and Marissa vanished, and the testimony of the gas station clerk who remembered his car. Each piece of evidence built the picture of a man whose obsession had curdled into cruelty. Michael's defense team fought viciously, arguing that the FBI had latched on to Rachel's ex out of convenience, that handwriting comparisons were subjective, that the purchases could be coincidental, and that the GPS data only proved he had traveled, perhaps for camping, perhaps for work, but not necessarily for murder. They painted their client as a scapegoat for a community desperate to close an unsolved mystery, weaving in the folklore of the Adirondacks, the whispers of cult activity, suggesting someone else had planted evidence to frame him. They called their own experts who tried to cast doubt on the timeline of Marissa's captivity, questioning whether she truly survived beyond Daniel, sowing uncertainty with each technical phrase. And through it all, Michael sat expressionless, occasionally turning his gaze to Rachel, a half-smile flickering at the corners of his lips, as though the trial itself were just another game he was playing with her. The emotional center of the trial came when Rachel herself was called to the stand. She recounted her relationship with Michael, the charm that drew her in, the subtle possessiveness that grew into obsession, the breakup that spiraled into angry messages and late-night calls. She described the letters, how the handwriting in those envelopes had haunted her, and seeing it echoed in the journal found in the cave had made her blood run cold. Her testimony cracked her voice, but she pushed through, knowing her sister's memory deserved no less. The defense tried to rattle her, suggesting her grief made her see patterns that weren't there, that her testimony was colored by guilt for introducing Michael into their lives. Rachel broke down on the stand but answered firmly, "I didn't put Marissa in that cave. He did." The silence that followed was heavier than any gavel strike. Eli Turner, too, became a pivotal witness. The retired ranger described finding the cave, the stench of decay, the chains that still clung to bone. His voice, steady but worn with age, carried the weight of years patrolling those woods, and when he admitted that he had passed near that very spot countless times without knowing what horrors lay inside, the jury shifted uneasily. His testimony humanized the scale of the crime. It wasn't just about evidence, but about the unimaginable suffering hidden in plain sight. Eli's presence reminded everyone that the wilderness was complicit only in its silence. The true predator was sitting a few feet away. As the trial stretched into weeks, the prosecution revealed their most chilling evidence – audio recordings from an undercover FBI informant who had spoken with Michael during his arrest in Los Angeles. The jury listened as Michael's tone, calm and measured, spoke of teaching Rachel a lesson and taking away what she loved most so she'd never forget me. Though he never explicitly admitted murder, the implication was undeniable. The words hung in the courtroom like smoke, choking even those who had already made their minds. The defense objected furiously, claiming the recordings were manipulated, taken out of context, but the damage had been done. Closing arguments crystallized the story into two competing visions. The prosecution asked the jury to see the evidence not as fragments but as a whole. The purchases, the GPS trail, the journal, the testimony, the recordings. This was not random, the lead prosecutor declared. This was obsession turned to punishment. Michael Hayes could not have her Rachel, so he destroyed Marissa and Daniel simply because they stood in the way of his control. The defense countered by warning against the seduction of narrative, urging jurors to demand certainty in the face of tragedy. They repeated that the evidence was circumstantial, that the true killer could still be at large, that doubt was the only responsible verdict. But as the jury deliberated, it was Michael himself who delivered the most haunting moment. Allowed to speak, he rose and faced the court, his voice eerily calm. "You think you've uncovered the truth, but Rachel knows it isn't over. I wasn't alone. The cave wasn't mine alone. Others believed in what we started. You'll never find them." His words sent ripples through the courtroom, Rachel burying her face in her hands, Eli clenching his jaw in silent rage. Whether it was truth or manipulation hardly mattered. The seed of doubt was planted, and the horror extended beyond Michael alone. The jury returned after 2 tense days, guilty on all counts – kidnapping, murder, conspiracy. Michael barely blinked as the verdict was read, his half-smile never faltering. As though the verdict was just another performance, he alone understood. Rachel wept openly, clutching Eli's hand, while the courtroom exhaled the breath it had held for weeks. Yet the relief was laced with unease. Michael's final words echoed in every ear. "I wasn't alone. Others believed in what we started. You'll never find them." Outside reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, headlines exploded across the country. But in the quiet that followed, in the dark spaces of Rachel's mind, the victory felt hollow. Justice had been served, but peace was nowhere to be found. And as the courthouse emptied, Eli walked into the night, knowing the Adirondacks still hid shadows no verdict could banish.
The verdict marked the end of the trial, but not the end of the story. As the gavel fell and the courtroom emptied, Rachel felt no surge of triumph, only a hollow ache that stretched deeper than before. Michael Hayes had been convicted,
The jury had condemned him to spend the rest of his life in prison, and yet his final words, "I wasn't alone," echoed in her mind like a curse. In the days that followed, the media devoured the trial. Headlines screamed about obsession and cruelty, and Rachel became a reluctant figure in the national conversation, her grief twisted into sound bites for morning shows and podcasts. She endured interviews she didn't want to give, repeating fragments of her sister's life while trying to ignore the insinuations that Michael might have been telling the truth about accomplices. For Eli, the aftermath carried its own torment. He returned to the Adirondacks not as a ranger, but as an old man burdened by ghosts, retracing the trails, staring at the shuttered mouth of the cave now sealed by federal order. He knew the forest well enough to understand how easily another cave, another hollow, could hide horrors yet undiscovered. At night, he dreamed of chains clinking in the dark, of muffled cries swallowed by stone, of Marissa's journal pages fluttering just beyond his reach. Meanwhile, the FBI refused to close the book entirely. Special Agent Carter launched secondary investigations, chasing down any hint of Michael's claim. They combed through his phone records, his bank accounts, his past associations, trying to uncover evidence of a network or accomplice. Nothing concrete emerged, but traces lingered: cryptic emails, encrypted messages never fully decoded, receipts from meetings in states far from New York. Each discovery deepened the mystery rather than resolve it. Public fear simmered, with rumors of hidden cults thriving in the Adirondacks, feeding late-night news segments and fueling true crime documentaries. Locals whispered of shadowy figures seen in the woods, of strangers camping near old logging roads, of unmarked vans parked where no one belonged. Whether truth or paranoia, the region's reputation blackened, and tourists came now not for its beauty, but for its darkness. Rachel tried to rebuild her life in Los Angeles, but grief followed her like a phantom. She avoided the places she had once visited with Marissa, kept Michael's name from her lips, and yet found him in every shadow, every flicker of news on her phone. Therapy offered little comfort. The past was not a wound to be stitched, but an infection that spread deeper each day. She replayed the trial in her mind, the sight of Michael smiling as if he had won even in defeat. What unsettled her most was the possibility that he had been telling the truth. If others had shared in his cruelty, then Marissa's death was not the final act, only the first of something larger. She lived with that uncertainty like a ticking clock she could never silence. Eli, sensing Rachel's despair, reached out, writing letters that became a quiet correspondence between two broken souls bound by the same tragedy. In his letters, he described the woods not as a place of horror, but as a place of memory, reminding her that for every cave, there were also ridges of sunlight and streams that ran clear and cold, places Marissa would have loved. Rachel replied, hesitant at first, then with growing honesty, confessing her fears of accomplices, of shadows that would never lift. Together they carried the weight, though neither found peace. The final scene unfolded months later, when Eli, restless, returned once more to the forest. Winter had iced the branches, the silence broken only by the crunch of his boots. He walked past the cave, now chained and locked by steel gates, and stood there for hours. He imagined Marissa and Daniel shackled in the dark, imagined the years stolen from them, and felt the futility of every search, every trial, every headline. And yet, as he turned back toward the trail, he caught something that froze him in place. A crude symbol etched freshly into the bark of a tree, the same symbol that had been painted on the cave walls. His breath caught. The case was over in court, but not in truth. Somewhere in those endless woods, something darker lingered, patient and unseen. Eli stepped back, heart pounding, knowing what Michael had said was no bluff. The Adirondacks were not done with their secrets.